I think it's so lucky for people who come along today who are creative and have my sorts of problems. You know, it's not dyslexia, but it really was a problem. That they're free now to do. I mean, you can even do voice recognition software if you can't type. You know, you don't even have to be able to type.
Do you know that very issue has opened a whole, it's a whole other can of worms, because now imagine how easy it is for anyone who so desires to sit down and crank out 400 pages and call it a novel.
Oh, well, yes.
Think about how overwhelmed agents and editors, publishing houses, booksellers are now.
You know, it's a nightmare. It came up at Left Coast Crime in Anchorage, Alaska, which was the 2001 mystery conference for the west of the Rockies, left coast. And a major issue for the organizers and for the dealer room had to do with who is an author.
Yeah.
And there are, I have learned from this, because always being one to rush in, you know, fearless, I had an opinion about how that should work, because it's a nightmare for me at the store. There is not a day that goes by that I don't get several emails from aspiring writers, hopeful, you know, newly published writers saying, visit my website, you know, read my first chapter, please give me feedback and all. You know, I don't have time.
Yeah.
I just don't, much as I would like to. What I realized was that I was looking for the needle in the haystack always, because that thrill of the treasure hunt, that thrill of discovery is what drives you as a bookseller. And at the same time, I was pitchforking so much hay, I was getting nothing done. You know, it wasn't, the cost of finding the needle was rising to the point where I just can't do it. What I learned was that the Romance, the RITA organization, had actually published some standards a while back for their conference, which defines what a published writer is. And it's fairly stringent. It includes things like, you know, your publisher has to have at least 5 authors on its list, and none of them can be related to you. You know, and it can't be a co-venture, and it can't be something you paid to have done and all, because in fact anyone today can anoint themselves an author. And a book ideally has gone through an editorial process. It has had some dialogue between you, the writer, and some critical reader who has said, you know, Kent, about that excessive verbiage here, or don't you think maybe you carried that too far, or didn't you forget that?
Right.
Or how come he's blue-eyed here and brown-eyed there, although that's more of a copy editing than a substantive issue. There isn't a book, in my view, that will not benefit from some dialogue, some editorial process, no matter how good the author is.
I agree.
It's just, one author wrote to me when I wrote to point out to him that he had misused lie and lay consistently through his book, and I found, you know, found it hard to deal with. And he said, as a former English teacher, the fact that he, you know, 144 times or something, he had this. And then he said to me in kind of despair, he said, you know, this was a huge manuscript, 140,000 words, and he said, there I was with no safety net. No one at my publisher was actually paying attention to all this. And sadly, what I've learned is the more famous the writer, the less likely they are to really get edited, because the time factor, as compared to the success factor, doesn't pay off. You know, they're going to sell regardless. And that's very, very difficult. Anyway,
well, there you go. That's just one more strike against the whole notion of huge books, the list of authors going smaller and smaller, publishing houses believing that they can foist anything off on a public because they'll buy anything by a name, you know? And everybody suffers. I think the writing suffers, the authors suffer, the readers suffer.
Sure, because what you do is you turn an author into a brand name, like soup. And then they, you know, and I think that's unfair.
I wonder if writers don't, in that situation, don't just get sloppy, you know? I'm not going to be edited, I'm not, I wonder about that.
I don't think so. I think that writers really try, but what you learn is, when you do this long enough, that, you know, you're blind to your own mistakes.
Absolutely.
Your eye fills in what it expects to see, your ear hears whatever it's expecting to hear, and no matter how good you are, you know, you're going to miss something. It's just going to happen.
In a 100,000-word manuscript, of course you're going to miss things. You know, you really are going to have a brown-eyed and a blue-eyed character at some point.
Well, it's been very interesting. I think it has made our job a lot clearer. We have become essentially not booksellers, but book screeners. You know, when you've got this massive stuff out there, a reader is truly desperate for someone to say, this one, not this one.
That's right.
So I find that this system has kind of worked to my benefit. And I'm pleased that people who wouldn't find a voice, who wouldn't get published, you know, in conventional ways, are finding those opportunities. And some of it, the good stuff, will float to the surface. Perhaps not with my direct intervention, but at some point. Nonetheless, my original point was that the technology has probably enabled some people who might be silent. You know, just as it's certainly done wonders for handicapped people who can't find any sort of our mutual friend. Lewis, you know, who yes. A whole world has opened up for somebody really deaf, you know, to be able to communicate through email and computers and so forth is a fabulous thing. Does it encourage prolixity? Does it encourage sloppiness? I mean, you know, nothing's for free.
That's right.
Happily, none of these things seem to have happened to you. And I'm very interested to hear that you've done a few short stories, and I'm wondering if at some point, you know, you may come back to them in the crime form or in any form.
I enjoy doing short stories. I look at it as a different kind of an exercise that keeps different kinds of creative muscles at work than I would be using on a book. I enjoy it. I usually only do short stories these days if I'm asked to contribute to an anthology of some kind. But I have an enormous drawer full of unpublished short stories at home that at some point I look at them and I think, boy, you know, I'd love to make this a mystery short story.
Well, you may be able to do that. You know, in closing, I should remind ourselves, because we have not mentioned it, that Iron Lake not only I thought was a great book, but so a lot of other people. It was nominated for this and that, and if I remember right, won the Anthony Award.
Yes.
For Best First Novel.
Best First.
And I was there to applaud you in Milwaukee. Am I right?
Yes.
When it won, and I thought it was terribly exciting. You and Steve Hamilton had written books, I thought, that had lots of things in common in that one year. And Steve won the Edgar, you won the Anthony, and I thought, yes.
Yeah, I feel like we graduated from at the same point in time, and it was so odd that we write from the same place, many of the same sensibilities, and Steve's become just a very good friend of mine. So I'm just happy to see his books doing very, very well too.
He's a prince of a guy. He's going to come and visit us to sign Hunting Wind, and I'm thrilled that you've come to see us to do Purgatory Ridge. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
And
anytime.
Well, we'll keep this up, and thank you very much for coming to join me today. And I certainly thank all of you for joining us in another episode of the Criminal Calendar.